Welcome everyone. If the Zoom world is working, I hope you're all able to hear me and see me and the others that'll be our panelists for today. Thank you very much for joining us. I begin by acknowledging that the University of Colorado Boulder sits upon land within the territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. Further, I acknowledge that 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. So as we get started, just some initial logistics. As you registered for the event, many of you had submitted questions, and on each panel, we're going to begin with several of those previously submitted questions before we then field questions that you can submit live through the Q&A function here on Zoom. So all of the questions as well that have been previously submitted, and then also those that are submitted and posed today, will be compiled and then shared after the event. And if you want to pass it along to some others, folks have asked that for those who can't join us live now, we are recording today's event. We'll get it up on our website shortly afterwards. So to begin, we're going to have two short surveys, one at the beginning and one at the end. And we have two polling questions for you right now that we will activate. Please go ahead and answer these two questions. Just give you a few more seconds to answer the poll, and then we'll close it. Five more seconds. Okay, we ran it a little bit longer. Why don't we stop there? It looks like 90% of those who are on have responded. And so we can share the results. Can everyone see that? Wonderful. It gives us a sense of who is here and the group that's joining us, at least at the beginning here. Thank you very much. So to take a half step back, while you're still perhaps looking at those results, I'm happy to introduce myself. My name is Max Boykoff. I'm a professor in environmental studies, also director of the environmental studies program. I'm a fellow in the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, or CERES. And then I'm also leading this Colorado Local Science Engagement Network with Matt Druckenmiller. I'll say a few words about the Colorado Local Science Engagement Network and our efforts, and then colleague Cadidia Thiero will outline today's event in some more detail. At the end of the event, Matt Druckenmiller will share with you plans to sustain our work going forward from today. Also, Matt, Cadidia, and I will offer some final reflections and thank yous before we wrap up at the end of our 3 hours here. So the Local Science Engagement Network here in Colorado is one of 4 in other states, and it was established in February of this year. The objectives of this Colorado-based Local Science Engagement Network are twofold. First, to bring relevant and timely science to bear on policy decisions at the local and state levels so that policies are better suited to address challenges related to climate change, to sustainability, to technology adoption, and natural resource management here in Colorado. And second, we seek to build and foster a contingent of scientists considered very broadly, working in Colorado, who are strongly engaged in identifying opportunities and relationships for bringing science into policy. So we in the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences here at the University of Colorado have partnered with the American Association for the Advancement of Science to support this network. So this event today is also co-sponsored by the Environmental Studies program at the University of Colorado, as well as Inside the Greenhouse, which is an interdisciplinary project at CU, and also our friends at Western Colorado University, who've been very involved in the production and promotions. So in our local science engagement network in Colorado, we have 3 focus areas to signal our priorities and assess topics with broad and long-term relevance to Colorado. These are designed to be responsive to current science policy issues, as well as active decision-making arenas here in Colorado. They take shape in events like the one we're in today, science notes from across the network that you can find on our website, and convening knowledge exchange workshops with policymakers. In short, our focus areas are around carbon-based and renewable energy, calibrating this with the Polis administration's roadmap to 100% renewable energy by 2040. Secondly, climate and environment, tracking key indicators of Colorado's climate and environment as they relate to societal benefits and stakeholder interests. And third, technology, which ranges for us from emerging technologies to questions around rural broadband here in the state. So as a group, we endeavor to address intersectional challenges that thread through these issue areas. So that brings us to, again, today's discussion on institutional racism in STEM at both the US and Colorado state levels. We hope that this event marks an important continuation of a sustained conversation. End climate silence and shut down STEM are markers of reflections on institutional racism in STEM and confrontations with our complicity in them. This is an ongoing process. We have a long way to go, yet 2 things are clear. We must spend more time learning about each other, our experiences, our passions, our aspirations, our concerns, and we must actively support one another as we learn and change together. Our commitments here are to be open, honest, respectful, and this will be uncomfortable work as we interrogate institutional racism, but it'll also, as we go, reveal beauty, love, hope, and resilience as we contribute to positive change. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to colleague Khadidia Thiero to talk about today's event in more detail. Khadidia?
Greetings, all. Thank you, Max, for the welcome. My name is Khadidia Thiero, and I am the program lead for the undergraduate bridge program, The Significant Opportunities in Atmospheric Research and Science, or otherwise known as SOARS. We are a UCAR community program based in Boulder, Colorado, and I am also an advisory group member of the Colorado Local Science Engagement Network. We are excited to host this discussion. We are appreciative and grateful to all of our esteemed panelists, facilitators, and organizers. During the summer of this pandemic, many societal issues expose the systemic racism which remains embedded in the fabric of our society and extends to the STEM world. Along with other organizations such as UCAR and AAAS, Max and I discussed ways that we could demonstrate our purpose in dismantling racism in STEM. Matt Druckenmiller, Max and I decided on having this conversation as part of our group's mission to engage scientists and leaders in this field. Thank you all again for joining this important discussion. The first panel will focus on the challenges of institutional racism in STEM, discussions at the US national level. The panelists will introduce themselves and have 15 minutes to present. We will hold all questions until the discussion portion, where we will have some pre-populated questions from the audience that the audience members submitted during registration. After the first panel and discussion, we will have a 5-minute break and start the next panel at 1:35 p.m. The second panel will focus on the challenges of systemic racism in STEM at the Colorado state level. And this panel will be facilitated by fellow colleague, Dr. Patty Romero-Lencao. We will begin with Dr. Vernon Morris, who's a professor and director at Arizona State University.
Okay, I thought didn't realize I was going first, so let me try to queue up um, and share my screen here. Now I have to sort of dial back. Tell me if you can see my screen. I'm not sure. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me queue up to the front. I wasn't. So let me start by saying good morning. Thanks, Khadija. Thanks, Max and Matt, for inviting me. Thanks and good afternoon or good morning, depending on which side of the continental divide you're on, to everyone who's dialed in. My name is Vernon Morris. I'm the director of the School for Mathematical and Natural Sciences at Arizona State University and the new college there. But prior to being at Arizona State, I was at Howard University for 24 years. And so I have experience within a minority serving institution, dealing with majority institutions, and now sort of on the flip side of that, in a majority institution or historically white institution, although it's rapidly browning at Arizona State, and trying to address challenges of inclusion in STEM. My pronouns are he, him, and I'd also like to acknowledge that as I'm coming to you from the Salt River Valley, this is a region that was inhabited by 22 native nations over centuries before colonization. The indigenous peoples whose care and keeping of these lands allow us to be here today include the Acamel Orum and the Pipash Indian communities. And I also want to acknowledge, and I think Max spoke to this, the value of conversations like this, not just now in reaction and a response to what's happening nationally, but because this is a humane and humanist way of going about all of our professions. And in science, science has been silent for a very long on this. And I think in an age where meaningful dialogue is being censured and there's attacks on knowledge and expertise, I think it's especially important to value discussions of racism and censorship. Sorry, that jumped forward a little bit. I'd also like to say that as I begin, language is important. And so I'm not going to use the language of minorities or underrepresented groups. In their place, I'll use racially marginalized, racially minoritized, or racially excluded. And I think that's more accurate because no one seeks to be excluded from science or as it is underrepresented in science. That's an action that is taken against a group, and the result is that there are less than one might expect based on the population. So I use racially marginalized in acknowledgement of other marginalized communities, whether it be gender identity, ableism, religion, other characteristics. So with that, I'll move along to the opening statement, which is really individuals who reflect the embodiments of racialized groups, racialized minorities, are demonstrably excluded from science, demonstrably excluded from STEM. Many of the departments across the nation have few or none or no racialized minorities. And I think the sources of these exclusions are drawn from some of the same manifestations, some of the same things that have caused the confluence of the pandemics that we see happening now in our larger society. And I say pandemics, a number of people are aware of, obviously, coronavirus, but there's a health pandemic that has been uncovered by this and exacerbated, a wealth pandemic, a racial hostility pandemic, a state-sponsored political and police violence pandemic, and an educational pandemic. And all of these are affecting communities of color, and in particular, Black communities. And so I want to speak to that in this talk. And the outline, as you see here, I'll talk about some of the national implications and really look at some of the numbers to start off with, and then get to racism in the scientific community. I'm a geoscientist, degrees in chemistry and geophysical sciences, so I'll speak particularly to a field that is extremely segregated, and then talk to some initiatives in No Time for Silence that have arisen to speak a lot more broadly about that, and then some anti-racism efforts at HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, and then specifically some anti-racism activities at Arizona State University, which have just spun up. And most of the slides will have a quote on it that I hope elicit some of the discussion or frame some of the discussion, but this is by Albert Memmi, who wrote The Colonizer and the Colonized. We are all tempted by racism. We risk behaving in a racist manner each time we believe ourselves threatened in our privileges, in our well-being, or in our security. And I think this is pretty timely, given a lot of the rhetoric that we probably saw last night if you watched the debates, and a lot of the rhetoric that's moving around in the world. If you look at the survey of atmospheric sciences departments, in particular PhD granting departments in the nation right now, there's less than 10 full professors who are African American in those departments. It's about 60 departments that offer the PhD. That's about 1% to 2% of the total positions. If you were to expand that pool to all departments that offer atmospheric sciences degrees, undergrad, master's, and PhD, then the percent drops to less than 1% if you're a Black faculty person being in one of those departments. And those statistics actually favor a Black person having a better chance of being the president of the United States and having an academic position in atmospheric sciences. That's the typical sort of manifestation of racism that we have to deal with in science. It's really about the numbers that we see or don't see. And that erasure or absence is not a per chance thing. It's not something that happens because Black or brown or indigenous people are not interested in geosciences or chemistry or particle physics. It's a matter of exclusion that happens from a very young age throughout the entire course of career pursuit. And so 2 more quotes and a picture. The photos that I have, each of the photos that I have are taken from the Library of Congress, I believe, the Library of Congress archive. So you can find some of these and many others. But the first quote is from Werner Heisenberg, the pioneers of quantum mechanics. Because we have to remember that what we observe is not nature in itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. And so when we ask questions about why are there so few of this group or that group someplace, we have to think about how we're framing that question and not putting the onus on that group, and perhaps looking at the system in which that group is struggling to persist or survive in. And what is it about that system that creates so few opportunities for this group? Might be a better way of framing the question. So I think we have to think about questions and how we ask the questions. Second quote is by Frank Candide, and the greatest resistance to justice is not the challenge against hatred. That's sort of a fringe response. It's a resistance to the overturning of false realities of meritocracy, self-identity, and the assumptions of self-worth and goodness. And I think one of the things that makes race talk or discussions on racism so difficult for so many people is because they view it as an attack on their own goodness. And so what I ask, and I agree with Max, these are uncomfortable discussions and they're uncomfortable conversations, but you grow through discomfort. And so you have to, and I appreciate the presence of everyone here, welcome or anticipate that discomfort, but decenter yourself from the discussion. It's not about your goodness. It's about how do we make a more humane scientific community? How do we improve the scientific community for its fullest capacity and its fullest growth? And that means you have to include everyone. So I'm not looking at time, but I guess I get a 2-minute warning. So what are the manifestations of racism that we see? I just pulled some numbers from some of the FSTEM reports, federal STEM workforce reports, as well as a survey of geoscience departments. BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, and people of color individuals represent over 31% of the US population. Less than 15% of the civilian labor workforce in 2016, less than 6% of the geoscience PhDs, less than 3% of the tenured professors in all atmospheric sciences programs, less than 10% of the senior executive service and science mission agencies. And so the language underrepresentation is basically looking at numbers in the population and saying, if all things being equal, you would see these same numbers reflected someplace else. So that numerical, the relevance of that numerical argument are pretty astounding when you look at where people are or where people are not. But if you think about the context of the country, America as a country has only outlawed extreme racial oppression outside of mass incarceration surveillance systems, which still exist and are legal, since 1969. When I was born, I had no legal protection to allow me to vote. So it's my lifetime. Many of our senior professors and administrators grew up in this same America when Black and brown people had no rights of protection against law or legal or political franchisement. And so if those are, whether they're intentional or not, if those are the folks who are moving through these systems, they're going to be fairly comfortable with systems that look a lot like them and don't have very much color because they were born into a segregated society. And I think one of the challenges in geosciences is that it looks as segregated today, very nearly as it was in the 50s and 60s before civil rights legislation. And the question I think we have to, everyone has to ask ourselves in the science community is why is that? And why aren't more fields further along than they are? And so in response to sort of this long arc of minoritization and marginalization and exclusion, there have been several calls to action that have come out more recently, certainly in geosciences, but across the academy. I am part of a team of 10 folks who stood up a site called No Time for Silence, a call to action for anti-racist science community and geoscientists of color. I invite you all to go to the website and look at what we've said there, but I'll talk a little bit about it here. But a number of these calls are saying very similar things. They're a call to Black and non-Black colleagues, collaborators, advocates, allies, not just to listen, not just to feel the pain, empathize, but actually to act to dismantle some of these structures and policies that perpetuate injustice and systemic racism. What we've done in No Time for Silence is propose actionable strategies targeted specifically at professional societies, specifically at federal institutions and federal agencies, specifically at or for academic departments. These are things and institutions that you can do, and for certain community science organizations that support geosciences and STEM. And these aren't mandates, but they are recommendations that say, if you consider these things, if you implement these things systemically, you will see change. One of the challenges that we continue to see is that we don't have sustained commitments, we don't have sustained incentives, and we don't have sustained elements in our governance structures and in our administrative structures to support anti-racism, to break down or really address marginalization of people once they get there. We concentrate on pipeline. Let's just get more people through a system that's faulty, that doesn't work. And so if we force more matter through, we'll get something on the end versus, well, hey, if this system is this faulty, why don't we fix the system? And so just a quote from No Time for Silence. It's not enough for scientists to simply say that we believe in equality, equity, full inclusion, participation, and voices of all people in the scientific community. I think by and large, everybody will say that. We must take action in a meaningful way to ensure that these goals are met and demand that our collaborators and stakeholders do as well. So we call on non-Black colleagues and collaborators to listen and act to dismantle the structures that perpetuate injustice and white supremacy. That's sort of foundational to No Time for Silence. And again, what the group has been doing is really advocating on a national stage, meeting with professional societies, leadership in federal agencies, and in some institutions to really install change, sustainable and long-term change. So I'm gonna round up the talk with just some anti-racism efforts at HBCUs and some examples of what a sustained effort can actually do. On the left-hand side is just a graphic showing the production of HBCUs, which represent a very 3% of all academic institutions, are producing an outsized impact of Black students who go on to be PhDs in science, successful in a number of careers. And in fact, the models and procedures at HBCUs, if adopted at majority institutions, could really revolutionize education and anti-racism efforts. But why haven't we done that? I mean, it seems like that would be an obvious thing to do rather than reinvent the wheel in this overly academic way and not talk to places that have 2 minutes or none, no minutes, 0 minutes. All right. Okay, well, I thank you for for the time, and I'll unshare my screen. Can I say one real quick thing? I will. One quick thing is, one small program at Howard University graduated 50% of the African-American PhDs in atmospheric sciences between 2006 and 2016, and 30% of the Latinas PhDs in atmospheric science in 2006 and 2016. If one school can do this, that model should be borrowed and propagated across many schools, and we will see something very different on a decadal scale. If we don't do things that are revolutionary and radical, we will not see that. So hopefully there's ample time for my colleagues to stop my share, and time for questions. And if you need me to share the slides, I'll certainly do that on some of the things I missed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vernon Morris. We appreciate you, and we will come to questions in the discussion after all of the presenters. And also, just for your information, the attendees chat is disabled. If you have questions, you can ask them in the question and answer box. And thank you again, and we will move on to our next panelist, which is Dr. Siddip Parikh. Dr. Parikh.
Thank you, Khadija. I apologize, I don't seem to be able to start my video. If someone could get that to work. Oh, terrific. Can you see me? I think you can see me now. All right. First of all, I'd like to thank Khadija and Max and Matt. I want to thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your leadership of the Local Science Engagement Network. This is a terrific and important conversation to have. My name is Siddip Parikh, and I have the privilege of being the Chief Executive Officer of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, and serving as executive publisher of Science Magazine. That's probably how you know us, if you know us. It is that we publish Science every week along with its sister journals. And then we represent over 100,000 scientists across the country. And we advocate for science. We advocate for many things around science. We advocate for funding levels for science. We advocate for the inclusion of science in decision-making at the national and local level. That means having science at every decision-making table. And we also try and advocate on issues that affect the entire scientific enterprise. And that's why I think this conversation is so important. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about our work as a society. And just want to thank Dr. Morris. He had a little bit there about societies. I'm going to speak to that more directly about what societies can do in this space. He had such a great introduction that I will skip the introductory part, and I'll take it as an assumption that we recognize the challenges that we face as a scientific enterprise. And so that leads us to the question of what can an organization like AAAS do? It turns out there's a lot that an organization like AAAS can do. And I'm going to walk through what we've done over the last 6 months. So the organization has had programs starting in the 1970s that have dealt with diversity and inclusion and equity since before those were 3 words that you put together. And those programs have been ongoing since that time. We've had leaders within the organization like Shirley Malcolm, who have been, frankly, way ahead of their time in terms of talking about DEI as becoming normative. So actually including DEI in the sort of baked into how we do science, how we grow the scientific enterprise. And that work, despite all the work that's been going on for the last 50 years, hasn't gotten us much progress. And so I want to talk just a little bit about that. And then I'm going to talk about the concrete actions that the AAAS is putting into place through some draft plans. If you're a member of AAAS, you saw an email from me actually yesterday. We released the second of our 3 draft plans addressing systemic racism in the sciences. And so I'm going to share some slides now that walk through those draft plans. And they're called draft plans because they are works in progress. Dr. Morris talked about these are awkward, challenging, tough conversations. They are. And not only are they challenging and tough, we're going to make mistakes. As an organization, the AAAS is going to make mistakes in how we try to address this. And so the best thing that we can do is listen and learn from the actions of others around the country and try and incorporate those into what we're doing. So let me talk about those draft plans, the concrete actions we're taking, and then I'll talk about how we're going to try and keep momentum going, because I think that's the other key part of how we actually make progress here. How do you keep momentum going? These opportunities come in a generation, and they tend to come once in a generation. They tend to come born of tragedy, and that's what we're seeing here. But when those opportunities come, how do we not let them slip away? So we'll talk about that towards the end as well. So let me share my slides. Will someone mind telling me if I'm sharing the right slides or if I'm sharing the preview screen? All right, I'll take it. Excellent. All right. So the first thing is to give you a preface for this. This is the first of 3 draft plans. So the AAAS made a commitment back in April to take concrete actions to address systemic racism. There were lots of statements floating around at the time from scientific societies, from universities, all over the place about the problem, but there wasn't a lot of concrete action. And so we decided to have 3 draft plans. The first of those was released in June. It was called Holding Up a Mirror to Ensure Accountability. I'm going to walk you through that one. Our second one, we just released yesterday, which is on our programs and initiatives to actually affect the enterprise itself. And then the third, which is coming out in about a month, are our actions to ensure DEI within the AAAS itself, the organization itself. And so I'll walk you through those. First, these plans are, I'm taking these slides directly from our plans or on our website. I'd encourage you to go and have a look in detail there. The introduction here is really setting up the same discussion that Dr. Morris did, which is that science, engineering, and medicine are not immune to the discrimination, subjugation, and silencing of our minority colleagues and voices, and that we really have a lot to work on. And that, as I said, almost every generation has arrived at these moments of opportunity that are born of tragedy. And we're going to have to work on systemic change. How do you incorporate systemic change into our way of developing the scientific enterprise going forward? And we as an organization decided that we can and must be a powerful voice for change. And how could we do that? The first draft plan talks about holding up a mirror to ourselves. AAAS functions as a career advancement enabler in science and engineering. If you publish in the science family of journals, you are on your way to a great career in research in either academia or industry. If you are recognized as a AAAS elected fellow, that gives you incredible additional credibility and stature that you can add to becoming a full professor or moving further into academic leadership. If you receive one of our science and technology policy fellowships, it opens a pathway to a career in science policy. We have over 3,400 alumni of the S&T Policy Fellow Program. Those folks are embedded across government, across industry, and really help shape science policy. Winning one of our awards furthers your career into scientific leadership. Serving in our governing bodies really allows you to shape how the AAAS moves forward. And that leads you to the conclusion that AAAS should be as diverse as the society that it serves. And so just a summary of these actions, and I'm going to walk you through each of these. We're going to make diversity, equity, and inclusion normative in what we do. So build it into everything that we do by undergoing what we call the AAAS Sea Change Assessment. Sea Change is a program started by Dr. Shirley Malcolm over 2 years ago, meant for academia, and really it's coming into its own now, and it's housed at AAAS. We decided to give ourselves the assessment. We weren't going to ask academia to go through an assessment that we weren't willing to go through ourselves. So that includes collecting and making public aggregate demographic data on authors, reviewers, award winners, and fellows. I'm going to talk about that. As I told you, we publish Science Magazine. It's important that we can collect this type of demographic data. We're going to collect and make public aggregate demographic data within our selection functions of the AAAS, so how you get those awards. Also for our workforce, particularly our leadership and our editorial staff. And for transparency, and so that the community can hold us accountable, the data is going to be published annually. And that's a key point. The transparency part, because we want to be held accountable. And the only way we're going to be held accountable is if it's public. It can't be just at the board and management level. Now, for the board and management, we're going to review and act upon our demographic data on a monthly basis. So let me talk about Sea Change for a second. Sea Change is a comprehensive initiative, and it really works by first starting with this self-assessment. It's holding a mirror to yourself. It's looking at yourself and saying, let's be realistic about what we are as an organization. And then building into our processes and structures ways to achieve our goals, making it normative, making it part of our system. It answers the question, how do we untie ourselves from the practices of the past that made inequities possible and actually inevitable and are allowing them to persist? And I think that's another frame of some of the things that Dr. Morris was talking about. AAAS is committed to our Sea Change principles, and you can find those on our website. and working through a process of continuous learning and improvement. And that's what I mean by this being a draft plan. You're going to find fault in this, and I hope you'll tell me, and I hope you'll tell the AAAS. And you can learn more about Sea Change at a site there. So now going into detail. When I say collect and make public aggregate demographic data on authors, award winners, and fellows, let me be very specific about this. So if you publish in the science family of journals, what is the demographic data of authors? What is the demographic data of the reviewers? What is the demographic data of the editors? If you submit a paper to Science, the first thing it does is it comes to an editorial group within the organization, professional editors. These folks know Science backwards and forwards, and they are truly just an amazing resource for the sciences. Valda Vinson, who looks at structural biology, knows more about structural biology than almost any singular scientist in the country, and can recognize when something is an important piece of science, important enough to be published in Science. The challenge there is, if that group is not diverse, then the aperture through which we're looking to say that a piece of science is important is not as broad as it should be. So to give an example, the discovery of a subatomic particle, that one's pretty obvious. When there's a brand new subatomic particle, to publish it in Science is a big deal. 30 years ago, if there was a piece of data that would have shown how to reduce health disparities for the treatment of hypertension in the Mississippi Delta, that probably wouldn't have made it into Science because the aperture was too small. The aperture was too small. It didn't realize that although the actual science, the actual prevention was quite simple, it wasn't a technological marvel, the impact was tremendous, but the aperture was too small for the editorial group. So it's making sure that becomes diverse. Same thing on AAAS elected fellows. Elected fellows is a feather in your cap. As you become a full professor, as you become a more senior scientist in industry, if you've had an amazing track record, you can become an elected fellow. We wanted to make sure we understand the demographic data there. And again, I mentioned the policy fellows, et cetera. So really working your way all the way through all the enabling functions of the AAAS. Also our governance, our board of directors, our AAAS council, our section leaderships. Every bit of this, we'll be publishing it at the end of this month, end of October. This month being October. I guess this is September 30th. Our senior management, we will go through and provide demographic data for each of these functions. And here's why. Transparency leads to accountability. So the demographic data in each of these selection functions will be published annually, and it'll be put up on our website. And we commit to providing clear data that doesn't try to hide trends by blending groups or highlighting only on one axis of diversity. You have to get granular here. You have to take a look at the data, and all too often, there's an incentive for leaders to show the bright side of things. And so if you have diversity on one axis, perhaps on gender, or perhaps on another one of the axes, you tend to highlight that to the detriment of others. And so we really have to be able to make sure that we're not obfuscating these trends by blending groups. There are some caveats here. Like in many instances, this data, it's compiled through voluntary self-reporting. And that means that the initial data sets are going to have limitations. And we're going to appeal to authors, we're going to appeal to awardees, but it's self-reported data. And what that means is it's messy. It's not perfect. Statisticians are going to have a field day telling me that I'm producing bad data. It's not, and I recognize that. The critical thing for me to say is that don't just throw stones at it, help us fix it. Tell us how to work with this data, how to make it better. So we'll hopefully work with the scientific community to make the data better. And then we're definitely going to incorporate and integrate review of this data into our oversight and cadence. I'll talk about staff recruitment and retention in just a bit, so I'll skip this slide. I want to make sure I get to the second plan. So the second plan is about the scientific enterprise and what we should be advocating for in the national conversation on on diversity and inclusion. And here, we're fortunate. We're one of the nation's most prominent voices in speaking to leaders and policymakers. And so we're going to use that voice to advocate for some concrete things. The first of these is that we have to make sure that you don't need the privilege of a family safety net to pursue the sciences. And what I mean by that is, particularly in times like this time of COVID, if you're getting a stipend, even if it's a stipend in the biological sciences to be in a graduate program, it's a pretty small stipend. And as a graduate, and maybe a first generation graduate, there's a lot of pressure to provide, perhaps even help provide for family, to provide for children, et cetera. And so we need to make sure that you don't need the privilege of a family safety net. And so there's a whole host of things that come with that. Increased salaries for graduate students and postdoctoral researchers, parental leave and other stable employee-like benefits. Being an apprentice is a thing of the past, in our opinion. This is a career. We need to treat it like one. And then you see some other things there as well. I know that I'm running out of time, and I want to be very mindful of that. So this is on our AAAS website. I encourage you to look at it. Know that we have concrete actions. Know that we want to keep the momentum going. So we're going to continue to release draft plans over the next couple of months, so this conversation doesn't stop. The important thing is to keep it going, because I will tell you, I went back into the history of AAAS, and there was a moment just like this in 1970. We had a moment where there were demonstrations at the AAAS meeting, and there were councils put together, and it's the birth of the modern AAAS, but it stopped. It stopped around 1974, 1975, and it lost momentum. And we're committed not to letting that happen. So thank you so much for the time. And Khadidiyah, I hope I didn't go too far over.
You did not. Thank you very much, Dr. Parikh. And you can stop sharing your screen. Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Dr. Wendy Smythe from the University of North Minnesota.
Oops. Okay. I want to echo the sentiments of the other panelists by thanking Max, Matt, and Khadidiyah for the invitation. I'm going to do a formal introduction, so bear with me for a moment. Hadalas, at untersons de gode lagen, gest akas gustudi lagen, diu hadas hatagen, stas dis digwai kagan ai uijang, de klingai klakia ai gagen, stach lua hinu dekeong, Wendy Smythe, yatsai kith hinu dekeong, hekta handalai stuth ijang. Good people, I'm happy to be here with you today. I'm Alaska Native Haida of the Eagle Minority of the Fish Egg House, and I'm an Indigenous scientist. My Haida name is K'sta'lua. My given name is Wendy Smythe, and my people come from Heidelberg, Alaska, located in Southeast Alaska. I am faculty at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. Prior to that, I was a AAAS fellow at the NSF for 2 years. I am in 2 departments, Earth and Environmental Science, as I'm a geoscientist, and I'm in the Department of American Indian Studies, as I do a lot of work around coupling traditional knowledge systems and working to develop K-12 curriculum to empower Indigenous communities in education, and coupling these 2 knowledge systems of traditional knowledge and Western science. Let me find my mouse here. All right, so I want to start with the state of STEM. First, we have to be honest about the current state of the STEM disciplines that we are in. Why do we have low numbers of diverse students, colleagues, and mentors? Part of that is because we have this promise, the promise that it's going to be a great experience, it's going to enrich our lives, it's a welcoming environment, we will support you. This is how we recruit people, but the reality is very different. The reality, we're often out there on our own, and it's a struggle. So why stay in a field when it's so difficult? Our promise does not align with the reality, and we have to start producing environments and programs that are not only safe, but secure and welcoming. So when I start with this, what am I? Am I a Native American? Am I Alaska Native? Am I American Indian? Who am I? Most of the time, you know me as what mainstream society tells you I am. In the United States, there is an unspoken and unconscious idea that everyone has the right to use natives as they see fit, and those actions are justified and rationalized as honoring. Indigeneity is considered a national heritage and an entitlement that it is not. However, the US has created a mythology that provided a narrative to define who we are, what we look like, how we act, our intelligence, and all of this has been institutionalized, not only in the United States, but globally. These narratives have laid the foundation of how we are viewed. We're not viewed as real people. We're a costume, we're a mascot, or something else to brand an item. We're viewed as the offenders, as savages, when in reality, we were just protecting our family and our livelihood. There's no regard for the religious ceremonies or spirituality in Indigenous communities, and there's a lack of understanding and disregard for our traditional knowledge systems, where we're often considered unintelligent and lack an understanding of there's a prolific lack of understanding of tribal sovereignty and treaty rights. With a lot of current battles going on, not only in the United States, but in Canada, where treaty rights are considered Indigenous populations asking for a handout, of which they are not. I want to talk briefly about how we're branded in regard to the current political system that continually brings up Pocahontas. And I feel like it's an important thing to do because in Indigenous country, we have an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And if we look at this story of Pocahontas, you're familiar with it. It's a Disney story, a romanticized view of what happened to a 16-year-old girl who was kidnapped, raped, tortured, and exported to another country to sell tea. If you go to the Capitol and you tour the rotund, you will find this image on the far left corner that depicts Pocahontas' beautiful romantic wedding with her father looking on. That never happened. But it's continually used in current political system. Pocahontas, we could say, is our first documented missing and murdered Indigenous woman. Indigenous women, 84% of Native women will experience violence in their life. 53% of our sisters who are affiliated with the LGBTQ community, 53% will experience violence in their life. As compared to, and I'm not saying this is acceptable because it never is, but there's a discrepancy. Our Caucasian sisters experience 35% violence in their life. That 84% is an epidemic in Indigenous communities. And it's perpetuated by this narrative of who we are. I want to also acknowledge on the top there, these are images of boarding school, and let you know that today the background is orange because today is the day of recognition of those children who survived through boarding school. I want to tell you who we are. We are Indigenous scholars. We're scientists, we're social scientists, we're educators, we're cultural practitioners. We are reclaiming our language, our culture, our ways of knowing from the attempted ethnocide that this country perpetrated against Indigenous people. we use our cultural way to teach science, the engineering in carving a canoe, a traditional canoe, the geology of knowing what type of rock formation, what type of ground are you going to find this tree in, the ecology of the environment. We tie all this together. And I would argue that there's no room for mistakes. We must hold ourselves accountable for our own actions. We have had 400 plus years of mistakes. I believe that time is over. So I want to move on into telling you some of the things that I work in and some of the initiatives that I engage in to address some of these issues. One is in K-12, working with Indigenous youth to create a science curriculum to meet the students where they are. The curriculum is a nested model with the core of it being culture and language. Using language to teach science, collaborating with elders, cultural practitioners, and tribal leaders to couple together traditional knowledge as well as Western science to show students that there is no hierarchy. One is not more important than the other. Indigenous knowledge systems are rooted in tens of thousands of years of science, quantitative, qualitative, and spiritual beliefs. And we do this by taking traditional stories and coupling science disciplines to them. So a creation story could be used to teach anatomy and physiology, geology, and evolution. Reimagining STEM education in academia. There's a couple initiatives that are active. One is field work inspiring expanded leadership and diversity, working with faculty and field leaders to gain a better understanding of how to engage with diverse communities in a respectful and ethical way. And those diverse communities are not only racial and ethnic, but ability, sexual orientation, and identity, gender. And teaching ways to support students that are recruited so that we can engage the next generation of scientists to be successful. That project has continued on into what is now called Voices, and that has evolved a little bit. We're still doing faculty training, but we're taking that next generation and working with early career faculty, postdocs, and graduate students, and having two communities. One is the community that has privilege, and we're working on how to do power sharing. But there's also another community who has lost their voice for a variety of reasons. But we're working to help them reclaim their voice and understand that it's okay to speak out and how to do that also in a respectful and ethical way. Oftentimes in academia, it is difficult when you have to gain tenure to have publications. A lot of our stuff that we work on, creating toolkits, creating curriculum, creating community documents, even though it's based in scholarly research and work, it's difficult to have a review board, an editorial board. So at the University of Minnesota, we developed our own Native American editorial board as a collaboration between 5 different colleges: science, medicine, education, pharmacy, to continue to allow faculty to have that scholarship that they did not have available before. We produce faculty resources and toolkits to train on how to engage with students and do some role playing and set up some situations on how to engage when a student comes with a distinct way of knowing. I also work in Duluth on the Indigenous Women's Water Sisterhood. There we're using local traditional knowledge of the Anishinaabe and Dakota, coupled with education, social science, and science to create, again, K-12 curriculum for students in the region, to work with faculty to create a toolkit, as well as the research vessel that goes out on Lake Superior so that researchers are understanding that there is a cultural relationship with where they're doing research. We're also working with the city of Duluth to design 3 to 5 signs along the waterfront in the Anishinaabe language and in English so that people know that there is a cultural connection. But this is not a one-way street. It's a two-way street. And we also have to work with tribes to empower them to find ways to reclaim language and culture, to develop code of conduct for researchers and community visitors, on how to develop robust memorandum of understanding for researchers, and to develop tribal IRBs. Some of the institutional work that I've done is through hosting diversity, equity, and inclusion workshops with various federal agencies. And that is to broadly bring an understanding of what tribal sovereignty is, what are treaties, how to engage in ethical, respectful, and responsible research with a diverse population. Work with us and not on us. One of the things that I've done as well is annually for the last 13 years, I have invited program officers and faculty and students who want to learn what a tribal community is and how to engage with them. I bring them to my tribal community in the summer to get that one-on-one and hands-on experience of seeing who we are, how do we live our life, and to realize we are people. The other thing I do nationally, and Vernon talked about this, is I'm part of the No Time for Silence movement. And again, we can answer questions about that. I know I'm running out of time. And so with that, I'll say, Aji Wadluwan, Ududokwagan. Please remember, everything is related, and we need each other to survive. Everything is related. The air, the water, the land, all has a spirit, and we are all connected together, whether we like it or not. So with that, I'll say Hawa, Dangut Olagan. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Wendy. We really appreciate it. And to all of the panelists, thank you very much. We have some questions that were pre-populated with the registration. So I will, I guess, pose the first question to Sudeep, and then Wendy or Vernon, if you'd like to weigh in, that would be awesome. So the first question we have from Rashi Agarwal, the Piramal Foundation, and please forgive me if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. How does racism in STEM influence the focus areas in national STEM research?
Thank you for the question. You know, I can answer that in two ways. One is the tactical way, right? So people always talk about this in terms of clinical research and the design of clinical studies. And perpetually, we are in this state where many axes of diversity are not included in clinical research, whether it's race, sex, age. There's just a huge number of factors that are not included in those types of clinical studies. And part of that is because sometimes the scientists who are involved in designing the studies are not diverse themselves. And you know, this is, to me, this is systemic racism just by definition, right? Because it's not that these scientists, as Dr. Morris said, you know, this is not about their goodness or not. This is about their aperture, not being able to see the need for this diversity. Now we're making small progress there. And if you even see it in the vaccine trials related to COVID, you see this emphasis on diverse communities, but we have a lot to do there in terms of communication. At the second level that you see it is at the broader picture level in terms of research. And so you just heard Dr. Smythe talk about the challenges in getting funding for some of the work that she does. And that's not an uncommon story. One of the things that we found in terms of bringing people into the sciences is that a lot of times what really gets them hooked is working on scientific topics that are compelling to them and that might be compelling to their community. And so that example I gave about health disparities in the Mississippi Delta, we've gotten better at this, but it's still not perfect. In the past, that would not have been seen. Health disparities is not at the same level of finding a new gene related to a disease. The scientific challenge of that when your aperture is narrow, doesn't look like that's as important, and it is. And so those are two examples, one sort of the broadest and one at the narrow, where racism and its effects have really hurt us in terms of the scientific enterprise.
Thank you so much. Would Wendy or Vernon like to weigh in on that question?
I was going to defer to Wendy. Let me put my camera on. That way she can see me looking at her. I'll defer actually right now.
Okay. I was going to say, please ask it again, because I was getting a bunch of messages about my camera. So if you please ask the question
problem.
Again.
The question was, how does racism in STEM influence the focus areas in national STEM research?
Woo. Okay. Well, I think one of the things I was going to say, and maybe hopefully this answers that question, is as scientists, we're supposed to be discoverers, right? We're supposed to be looking for the truth or looking for a new way of doing things, how to solve a problem, a hypothesis or question. And when we disregard other traditional knowledge systems, we're not being good scientists. And so I think that impacts our critical thinking skills, our discovery, our innovation, and way of doing things. Because are we really being good scholars if we disregard something because it's not familiar to us? I would say no. That's the first thing that comes to my mind with that question. So I think not only being inclusive for people, but different knowledge systems and ways of knowing.
Thank you so much. Vernon, you want to add or no?
Just a quick follow-up is that if you do not have the voices of voices that are attuned to marginalized populations and communities and people at the table when you are framing the structure of the programs, the policies that dictate this is a type of research that is privileged, this is important, you are eliminating voices from that and you are shifting what will be done and what's important. And so it's one thing to say we want to fund Hispanic faculty, but in what program? And who defined that program? Or we want to have indigenous, participatory research. Who structured that program? And was it structured in a way that took into account cultural priorities in those communities? Or was it, I think I know what's good for you? Or I think this is where we need to be going in terms of technology, which is already a privileged, innovation and technology are already highly privileged disciplines. And so if you just follow the track that they're on, you're going to continue to, I think, I like the aperture analogy that Sudeep was using. You're actually tightening and tightening the aperture and expecting that more people are going to get through. They're not. You are in fact making it nearly impossible to get through. So sorry, I talked a little bit long. I tend to.
No worries. It actually segues into the next question by Catherine Grabenstein, a CU Boulder graduate student. She asked, what policies can we institute to be anti-racist rather than relying on departments and universities to change when precedent has shown that they are reluctant to do so? Any takers?
I need to speak up. So, I think that's a really good question, first of all. I did see that question in the, you sent us 3-4 pages of questions, and I actually remember that question. So I think, great question. I think that is unique to where you are. I think one of the first things you want to know is who are you and why are you the way that you are? Not at the expense of doing something, but because you need to have that information to devise an effective strategy. And I think you cannot let administrators and institutional decision makers off the hook because the resources flow from them. And so there's a lot that you can do at the individual level. There's a lot that you can do at the grassroots sort of structural level. There's a lot that you can do at the faculty level, at the departmental level, school, all the way up. If they're coordinated and sustained, you're going to make progress. if they're not coordinated, even if you have fantastic ideas at the faculty level or at the department level, they're going to grind to a halt. You'll see a blip on the longitudinal statistics, and over time, nothing. And so what I would say to that is, one, don't let them off the hook. But two, find out why you are the way that you are and design a strategy that addresses that, and then couple it up and then couple it down. And I think student voices need to be centered in all of this. I only got a couple more years doing this and I'm gonna go fishing. But I think student voices need to really inform what we do. Right now, when I talk to a lot of BIPOC students, Black students, I say, the future could be yours, but right now it's not. Future isn't yours, because we're on a status quo path which says the future is not yours. And so you have to be in the conversation, in the room. You got to continue to agitate, and then couple with other groups. And through that solidarity, hopefully you get that sustained, coordinated program. Arizona State, the president charged the entire institution to come up with ideas. He immediately, from those ideas, within a month says, I will fund these 25, and I'm going to incorporate students, faculty, staff to not just critique those 25 ideas, but their implementation, and give me more. These are just the first 25, and they will be implemented this year. That's the type of commitment that you need at the top, and it's the type of continuous coordinated involvement that you need throughout the institution. From student to president have to be on the page that we want to make this change. And so,
thank you so much. Oh, sorry.
I'm
Sorry. The concept of student activism and agitation is actually going to be covered in the second panel. So just FYI. Did Wendy or Sadiq want to add to that question?
I'm happy to add a little bit. What I'd say is that I'm so excited by this generation that is in school right now, because you're not, and I don't want to blanket everyone of that age as being this way, but many people will not accept the world as it is. And I think that's incredibly powerful. And at an organization like AAAS, we're 170 years old, okay? We have things that are baked in that I don't even know about, and I'm the CEO of it. And so we have to, what caught my attention was shut down STEM, right? It caught my attention as a leader of an organization. That agitation caught my attention. And the organization, AAAS, we observed shut down STEM. And that is where these draft plans came from. There's a day of listening, a day of learning, a day of talking, and then a lot of follow-up after that, obviously. But that is important. And I am so excited and confident that we are going to get sustained change, because I see a generation that is willing to hold us accountable, which is why I want to make this data transparent and out there, because that's the only way that I get held accountable or my successors get held accountable. So yeah, I second what Vernon said strongly.
Thank you. Wendy, did you want to add? The next question is directed towards you.
Oh, I have just a little bit to add, I think. In doing what Vernon was talking about too, I would encourage people, when you're making these, trying to make these policy changes, be patient, be persistent, and know when your voice has been heard. And that is a difficult thing to do sometimes. And so what I tell students is, if someone argues with you, they heard you. They heard you, because we go into this fight or flight response, right? If you challenge the way I know the world, I'm not going to survive. Even though they don't consciously think that, when we change someone's worldview, we're threatening their idea of survival. If they argue with you, they heard you. You don't have to continue to argue with them. You can leave that conversation, because I guarantee you they'll come back. They will process that and come back. And that leaves out the emotion part, because it is emotional. It's very personal when these events happen to not only us, but our students and our people. It's very personal. and we have to learn to not react with that emotion. Also, when making these changes, recognize that DEI is not a one-time thing. This is lifelong learning. If you're going to do this, you're going to be learning about it the rest of your life, equal to your science, because we are so diverse. How could we know by one workshop, by one intervention, by one book? It's lifelong. So be prepared for that as well. And so that's where I would add to that.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for your insight. The next question is actually for you, Dr. Smythe. How will we challenge the history and stories of people of color taught in K-12, including history books and other teaching materials, which seem the norm in all school systems? It is from white perspective and amplifies their stories only. And that question was submitted by Janan Cornstalk, Water is Life Festival. And please forgive my pronunciation if it was incorrect.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think that was one of the questions I had already had. And so I had to think about that a little bit. And so there's a few ways of doing this integration. One, hire cultural practitioners. Train your cultural practitioners to teach, right? Second, train your faculty, your teachers. If they're teaching locally and integrating traditional knowledge locally, there should be an advocate from that community or liaison to know what to teach and know how to teach it because there's always this meaning making part, right? If I tell you a traditional story or I show you an image, you're going to translate that through your lens of how you know the world. So you have to have that community expert, that cultural practitioner to help you do the meaning making in the right way. Be willing to listen and learn and find the best way of integrating that. And again, that's working with elders, cultural practitioners, tribal leaders on what does this mean? It's okay to ask, what are you talking about? And how does this relate to science? And how do we teach this history in the appropriate way? Because it's hard to find these answers sometimes because it's buried in the mythology and buried in romanticism of something that it's really not. And then use what you've learned to create that curriculum, but continually hold yourself accountable to teaching it in the way that the community uses it. So there's still that learning component to it, I believe, and continually working with the tribes that you're working with if you're going to incorporate that knowledge, or have a few cultural practitioners working with you, because we don't all believe the same thing. There are 574-ish tribes, right, in this country, and we are all expected to represent each other. And we don't. And that's not just the indigenous community. That's our African American, Black communities. There's diversity within the community, right? But we don't acknowledge that. We want to have everything one way, and it's not. So we have to be willing to learn, and it takes time to learn. And I'll tell you, in indigenous communities, it takes time because we're just now being able to rediscover who we are. We're just now taking back our language and our culture. So it might take time for us to work with you too and interpret things in the way, because some of us, we lost our elders. And so we're learning our protocols from the beginning. So it takes time, so patience, but also be really dedicated to doing this work.
Thank you so much. Did Sadiq or Vernon want to add to that? You know, we do have other questions.
I just say what Wendy said.
Okay, what Wendy said. Okay, thank you. This one is actually geared toward you, Vernon, talking about an overview of the actions that you and the organizations that you represent have been taking to increase inclusivity in the science community, because, you know, you were cut off.
Well, you cut me off again. Wherever Presley is, you know. No, I think I did talk a little bit about what ASU is doing. So I'll spin back to No Time for Silence. As Wendy said, Wendy's a partner in crime over at No Time for Silence. And basically, in terms of professional societies, what we have been doing is talking directly to leadership talking to folks who are on the advisory councils, the executive boards, seeking those out and getting voice, as I said, voice at the level of decision making. And then, again, I think the great panel. So I'm honored to be on this panel because of the information that's being shared. I like the idea of norming inclusion, a sense of belonging and justice in the organization. And you do that by establishing the mission statement, by revisiting the charter, or, you have to go to those sort of geminal documents and say, this is how we're going to operate now. And you do that if you're at the leadership and decision making level. So we've been doing that predominantly, I think, spreading the word and advocating. I will say that over time, sort of longitudinally, establishing programs that have long-lived success. You might be familiar with a weather camp program. One of the reasons I say a pipeline isn't, it's great to bring more people in, but you've got to change systems. And so we, at one time, I was told, Black people aren't interested in geosciences. Okay, I started a weather camp that expanded from one weather camp in Washington, D.C. to as many as 13 across the nation. They were all fully subscribed by Black kids, Latinx kids, Indigenous, you name it, they were rushing to those camps. It's opportunity. It's not pipeline. It's opportunity. People are interested. Students are interested. We're all natural scientists. It's where do you get turned off? Where does someone put that gate up and say, no, this is not for you. You can't do this. I don't think you belong here. You might want to think about woodshop. Take those out of the way and you'll see a huge changes. I think supporting programs and coupling the programs at HBCUs can go a long way at minority serving institutions, places that cultivate that sense of belonging in science in really unique ways, and bringing that knowledge, cultural expertise, if you will, bringing that knowledge into as many institutions as possible. I know I went to the side of your question, but the Careers Weather Camp, Color of Weather is something that's been institutionalized at American Meteorological Society. I think there are unique things that you can do at professional meetings that, again, cultivate a sense of belonging, broaden social professional networks, and you do it in a sustained way so that it becomes a fabric of that institution. Weave diversity and justice in.
Thank you. Did Wendy or Sadiq want to add?
I'll just second something that Vernon said, which is in terms of these original documents. So I lead an organization that's 170 years old. It has made its mistakes over the years. The last time that the founding documents were sort of amended, the Constitution, et cetera, was 1950. Right, 1950, and so some things have happened since then, and so we are in the midst right now of modernizing those governance documents. And I want to tell you, it's hard, because as much as it looks like the Constitutional Convention was exciting and there was a lot of politic, there's a lot of politic in opening up these founding documents, but it's worthwhile. It's work that must be done, and AAAS is going through it right now. And I can tell you that amongst the working group that is doing that, DEI is central to what they want to make sure is incorporated into those founding documents. So I'm really excited about that. And I hope that others do that as well.
Thank you so much. The next question is for all of you. What does trust in institutions or science mean to you? Sent by our good friend at the Institute for Science and Policy, Kristen Uhlenbrock. You want to start, Wendy?
Ooh, Lord. Oh, that's a deep one, really, because let's go back to boarding school. Those memories, those traumas are alive. I'm the first generation in my family to not go to boarding school, and I'm almost 50. So that is alive and well in our community. So the education and research is viewed as not trustworthy. And so we have to develop these respectful, ethical relationships to change that narrative. And I suspect that this is widespread across diverse communities. So I think that trust part is so vital and so important, because if students don't have the support of their community and their family, they will not succeed. They have to be supported. And so I think some of these things that we're talking about doing, engaging in that meaningful, not transactional relationship with communities, not superficial, not to build our career, but to have a meaningful two-way relationship in research and education, we will start changing that narrative and developing meaningful, trusting relationships. Otherwise, we won't move forward. We can talk all we want, but if we don't develop these relationships and change the narrative and make that a normal conversation and not a unique one, we won't establish trust. And until we do, it's going to take a lot of time to develop and bring our students into these disciplines and change the field of science to make it more innovative, more productive.
Thank you. Sudhir?
You know, I was asked recently, why should people trust scientists? And my answer was, I don't think they should. Just because you have a PhD or an MD or a master's or a bachelor, you don't deserve trust for that. Trust is earned. And that means exactly what Wendy was talking about, building relationships. And that's why I'm always encouraging people, you know, everyone wants to, a lot of folks want to do the S&T Policy Fellowship in Washington. And it's really important. And we need more scientists in Washington. But we need more scientists in Colorado. We need more scientists working in policy in California, in New Mexico. We need them everywhere, building relationships with the local community, because no one's going to trust me if I fly in to Colorado and talk about science. They don't know me. They don't know who I am. They might trust you if you've been in the area and you've shown shared values, shared commitment to making your place better. And that's so important. So yeah, trust is fundamental to everything that we want to do as scientists.
Thank you. And Vernon, you'll have the last word.
You know, trust is something that needs to be earned and not assumed. And I think both Wendy and Sudeep spoke to this, that I think assuming that someone will trust you is a privilege. And a lot of marginalized, minoritized students that's not their lived experience. You walk into a room and people are shifting their purses or their belongings, or their laptop might need to be shifted a little bit further away from you. Trust is, and so just that differential. At the same time, those same individuals expect you, the untrusted, to fully trust them. And that's a power hierarchy that we don't often address. And I think that has to be addressed not just at the levels where the power hierarchy is extremely steep, students to mentors in the old mentor framework, but even faculty of color and funding agencies, faculty of color and non-faculty of color. You know, there's some really, you know, Black in the Ivory, if anyone has a chance to go look at that Twitter feed and see, you know, peek into the world of a Black academic or a brown academic or an indigenous academic, and what are those bizarre microaggressions, bizarre overt aggressions, and this is the life. And so building trust within that environment, I think that's a whole other panel. I think it's something we cannot take for granted. I think it's extremely important. I think that once trust relationships are developed, you know, you can only imagine what the scientific community might be if we really did all trust in each other's abilities and capacities. I think, you know, that is the aspiration to aim for, but we've got a long way to go, and we have to be very intentional about it.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. We really appreciate your contribution to this important conversation. Just a reminder to attendees that there will be a survey once you leave the Zoom. Please click on the link and complete the survey. We will try to get to the other questions on our website. Again, this is a recorded session. We will be posting the recording on our website for the Colorado Local Science Engagement Network. We are going to take a quick break and then get prepared for the next panel, which will be led by Dr. Patricia Romero Lancao. And Max, did you want to say a few words?
Nope, I'm just hearing continued support. So thanks so much for moderating that first panel, Khadija. And thank you to all the panelists.
So we will return in about 4 to 5 minutes. It's 1:32 now. So let's come back at 1:36. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing us together.
Yeah, thanks a bunch. Had fun. I'm gonna hang out for the next one.
Thanks to all of you. This is great. And I look forward to this next panel. So thanks, Patty. Thanks, Valerie, Holly, and Karen.
Welcome back, everyone, to this seminal, important discussion on institutional racism in STEM. We are about to begin for the second panel, and I will turn it over to Dr. Patricia Romero Lancao to be the facilitator for the next panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Kit. Thank you. I really want to welcome everyone. I am a Latinx woman and a social scientist, and I moved to this country and to this place 14 years ago, looking for opportunities for my 2 girls and for me. And the experience has been challenging, but also rewarding, because as it is happening with this group and this conversation, there are always possibilities to create alliances and to work together to build a better world. And I always have said, instead of talking about it, I want to be part of the change I want to see in the world. So without further saying and taking the time away from my 3 amazing panelists, I would like just to introduce them quickly and give them the forum. The first one is Karen Belli, then we will have Holly Olivares, and then Valerie Otero. So why don't we just get started? Each of them will have some minutes to share their ideas with you and to tell us how they see we can build a more inclusive and diverse community. So please, go ahead, Karen.
All right, thanks all. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be part of this conversation. I'm going to start sharing my screen and hope that works out. All right, assuming you all can see my slides. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking about structural racism in STEM in the way that I've experienced it, and particularly through environmental fields, and what I am considering as humanity as a strategy to combat it. And it will echo, I think, a lot of what was discussed in the first panel, but hopefully take on some nuance that I think is important for local work. I'm an assistant professor in the environmental studies program at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I'll be talking about, like I said, personal experiences, but also work that I've done as part of research with a lot of collaborators, some of whom I've named down there. So structural racism in STEM manifests in many, many ways. This is a headline from a column in Nature that was published yesterday by a colleague that highlights some of the seemingly benign ways that structures differentially impact some of us and not others. Just in the fact that some cultures, you might not have a first and last name, you might not have the same number of names, right? Lots of people globally experience this. And there are many sort of structures in place that operate in this way that impact folks. So today I want to focus on a few specific forms that it takes that have been important for me. And then I think we touched on it, but I'll take a moment here to briefly discuss what we often mean when we say structural racism, Largely, it highlights a long history of systems, institutions, norms, and structures that privilege white dominant culture and have led to unfair, unsafe, unwelcoming conditions for people of color. So as I said, the impacts of structural racism take many forms, and I won't spend too much time talking about some of these trends because we saw this, but it often leads to underrepresentation, uneven power dynamics, cultural taxation, burdens of service. But one that's perhaps harder for people to grasp, and what I think is coming more to the fore as we're having these conversations more openly, is the sense of isolation for scholars of color in STEM fields. So this figure here is showing the number of doctoral degrees awarded in STEM fields by race and ethnicity between 2000 and 2015. And you can see the trends pretty clearly. For me personally, I often characterize my life in two distinct phases. In the first, I grew up in Los Angeles in communities of color, where I went to a high school with over 3,000 students, and I could count the number of white students that attended on one hand. In the second half of my life, I went off to college and graduate school and studied in ecology and environmental studies. And pretty much always since then, I'm the only Black person and often the only person of color in these spaces. And in both phases of my life that I often reference, histories of structural racism play an important role. De facto segregation, gentrification, related practices underlie the dynamics in the first phase, while bias in teaching and research, disproportionate access to educational opportunities, and racist histories in STEM underlie sort of the second half. But the key takeaway here is there's often this oppressive feeling of isolation as a person of color in STEM. And we see this pattern improving due in large part to a lot of the work that's been done by folks like those who were represented in the first panel, but consistently the challenge remains. So as I said, I work in environmental fields, and in this space, we often talk about this idea of the green ceiling, and this is particularly based on work that's been done in non-governmental organizations, government agencies, and foundations that do environmental research. Much of this work has been done by Dorceta Taylor at the University of Michigan, who found that despite decades of promises to diversify conservation and environmental movements, efforts are falling short. And some of the main causes that have been highlighted are unconscious bias, discrimination, and insular recruiting. So this figure here just shows the trends of staff hiring of staff of color. And while we can see there are increases in younger stages for interns and staff hired more recently, amongst the leadership in these fields, the diversity tends to be quite low. But it goes well beyond the challenge of getting people into these fields, as was brought up before. Once we're here, the spaces can often feel unsafe and unwelcoming. I'm currently doing research with environmental scientists and conservationists of color to learn more about their experiences. So I want to share with you a quote that we published in a recent article about students' experience conducting ecological field research. The word was only said once, but it echoed in her ears. She heard stories of the word thrown at others, including her parents, but the word was never used towards her, the N-word. It felt like a punch to the gut. She looked around to her peers and saw blank faces. She immediately began to question her decision regarding this work. Is this my new normal? Can I survive the field season when so much pain was inflicted on the first day? She thought back to her childhood, watching Steve Irwin on television with an infectious smile and bright optimism. She dreamt of being like him, traversing the outdoors to see all of the wondrous animals. Yet Steve Irwin did not look like her, nor did her peers. Many people of color I know and work with have experienced overt, explicit racism and microaggressions simply because they existed while doing their science. That incident that I just shared happened outside of Colorado, but here in Colorado, I do want to bring it home. The outdoors and science still don't always feel safe. Coloradans have such a meaningful relationship with their environment and such a commitment to it that it's really exciting to come here and do research. But cultural norms often make the space unwelcoming. Many young environmentalists, BIPOC environmentalists, have shared with me their experiences of being judged for not having the right gear to be considered legit to work in the outdoors. Another Black woman who's also Muslim shared with me how she was made fun of and othered for wanting to maintain a certain standard of hygiene while doing science in the field. Among many in this state, there's a narrow view of what a relationship with the environment means, and that makes it hard for many of those of us who don't fit that view to enter this workforce and be scientists in this field. What we're finding, what me and my colleagues are finding through this research is that many people of color have similar experiences to those that I've just described. Maybe they're not called a racial slur, though many are, but maybe it's presumed that they were hired because of their race or that they don't have the same skills or capacity of their peers. And we're finding that often one of two things seems to happen, and this is touched on also in the previous panel. Either they leave the field and go somewhere where they're not going to be the only one and they're not going to be perceived in a certain way, or they stay and feel an overwhelming compulsion and an overwhelming burden to try and fix things, to take on the task of making experiences for those who come after them better. Some of the people we've spoken to have described feeling like a martyr for the cause of equity in STEM. And because of this overwhelming compulsion and the associated mental anguish and emotional labor that comes with it, there are potential sort of trickle up processes that happen. So now I'm going to bring this sort of back to an academic setting, and as an early career academic, I think a lot about this. There's a lot of research that suggests that faculty of color and women faculty achieve tenure at lower rates than other groups, and this might be in part due to this extra service burden or a need to fix things. And so this figure here shows a bit of that, how there's more diversity among race and gender at the stages of lecturer and instructor than there are moving sort of up the academic hierarchy. And I've been working with a group of researchers in the environmental studies program here at CU to gather data to see if this trend holds at the University of Colorado in our tenure and promotion process. The good news is, at this preliminary stage of the research, is that there doesn't seem to be an impact of service burden and tenure issues along racial lines. The bad news is that there does seem to be some interesting trends along gender lines, with women less likely to achieve tenure based on the sample of data that we have. And this trend provides a really important opportunity to highlight the fact that oppressive structures that limit any one group of us limit all of us. I often quote the feminist scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, who first coined the term intersectionality by saying, when they enter, we all enter. When we make spaces for the most oppressed and marginalized amongst us, we all benefit. So how can we move forward? What can we do? In the context of structural racism in STEM, my sort of soapbox is one of bringing our humanity back into our science. And when I say humanity, I mean ourselves, our identities, our values, our histories, and our lived experiences. To put this into perspective, and again, this is something that was brought up in the previous panel, a recent study found that Black scientists were 20% less likely to receive funding from the National Institutes of Health than white scientists, and that this gap is largely explained by the types of research questions that they're pursuing. Black scientists were more likely to propose research that are encapsulated in the figure A on this image, surrounding interventions, patient health, children, and disparities amongst sort of health outcomes, and much less likely to propose research related to some of the topics in category B here. And consistently, review panels viewed such sort of patient-focused or community-focused research as less impactful and less worthy of funding. And this bias towards impactful research that lacks humanity and ignores the social, political, historical, economic processes that influence our health, influence the way we teach science more broadly and how science is viewed. And so as a result, I think people are less likely to be represented in textbooks and widely shared articles. And this was something that was emphasized in the previous panel. It means that budding scientists are unlikely to see themselves and their communities when they're learning about quote unquote science. For me personally, to bring my humanity into it, this manifested as growing up wanting to be an ecologist and study the environment, but rarely seeing myself and my environments represented in ecology. I obtained 2 degrees with the word ecology in them before I learned that people and environment meant more to me than just environment. And as a doctoral student, these are some fun pictures of me in the field in Southern Africa. I began my dissertation traveling there to study wildlife. But not long after I arrived, I realized that I was living amongst communities on the other side of the world who suffered from the same oppressive, marginalizing, and racist environmental management practices that plagued my communities in Southern California. For so long, my learning had focused on ecology and the environment in such a way that I was unable to see myself and to really understand some of the processes that were underlying it. And so when I talk about infusing humanity into our science, I mean normalizing and valuing the role of our identity and our lived experiences. And this will make it so that future scholars and future scientists can embody their work and feel more included in STEM. So to combat this, I consistently, and I hope that many of us are starting to consistently think about how we can bring humanity into our work. And really acknowledge the overt processes that have led to our current state of affairs. This can take many forms. For instance, in my lecture yesterday, before discussing a new statistical test with the students, we described its histories and taught students that it was actively used by early statisticians to promote racist ideals and fuel Nazi propaganda. The point wasn't, don't use this statistical test. The point was, think about how science has been used to oppress people in the past, how it may continue to do so, and how you can acknowledge and mitigate your bias when doing science. As I mentioned, I do a lot of work in countries in Africa, and in that context, I occupy a very different positionality than I do here in the US. There, I'm grappling with legacy of oppression and colonial histories in science, and the practice of knowledge theft and use of science to oppress. So in this context, bringing in my humanity means that I actively and openly acknowledge my privilege and the fact that existing scientific structures that I work within, for instance, the average length of a PhD or the duration of an NSF grant cycle or what universities value, are not made for me to push back against these colonialist structures that underlie the way we've been doing science for centuries. But acknowledging that to those around me is a way to remove the guise of complete objectivity in our science and recognize how my science impacts people. The last point I'll make is to remind you that there are organizations and institutions here at CU, here in Colorado, that are actively acknowledging structural racism and fighting against it. I'm highlighting CU Cafe because I work directly with them. That's an organization for graduate students and postdocs of color to provide space for growth, development, and networking beyond the university with scholars of color to support students in overcoming barriers to success. But there are many other organizations on campus in the state that do this work, and some of which I've listed here that are STEM focused. And I think it's important for all of us to uplift and amplify their work, determine if we can be involved and how, and then make sure students of color in the departments, that BIPOC folks know that these opportunities are available. I'll end here with an absolutely shameless plug for a CU Cafe talk that's happening in 2 weeks by Dr. Emilio Bruno, who's speaking on some of these topics at a different scale, talking about global disparities in creation and diffusion of scientific research and what we can do about them. You can learn more on CU Cafe's website.
Thank you so
I think I'm okay with time, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. You did such a great job. And what we will do is we will let the questions and answers to the end of the presentations. And I would like to give the opportunity to give Holly the opportunity to introduce us to her ideas, her insights on this important issue.
Thank you so much, Patty. And thank you to everyone who's here today. I'm glad that you're all here. I'm in the city of Boulder, which resides on land that was cared for and called home by the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute people, and other Native peoples from time immemorial. This land holds great historical, spiritual, and personal significance for its original stewards, the Native nations and peoples of this region. So I am of a mixed race. My father's heritage is Native American and my mother was white. I'm an oceanographer at the University of Colorado, Boulder. And if you're wondering, it's really hard to study the ocean from the mountains of Boulder, but we do it. And we do it by using computers and supercomputers to study the ocean from the mountains. I did not grow up in or near academia, nor science. In some ways, I'm an outsider with a fresh perspective on academia and science. My CV is evidence that I'm capable in academia, and my accolades are evidence that I'm a leader. I moved to Boulder just over a year ago to continue my studies of how the climate system works. I often say that I'm a communicator who now does science. My motivation is to negotiate what to do about climate change on a national and even an international scale. I've always known that I would do something big, but soon after George Floyd was murdered on May 25th, I realized a grave error in my thinking about what to do about climate change. I had not been actively working to eradicate racism in the place where I work, the University of Colorado, Boulder. My epiphany was that we will not figure out what to do about climate change if we do not address racism where we live and where we work. It simply won't happen. If we take a look around at the current state of people's understanding of the urgency and the seriousness of climate change today, we can see that what we've been trying is not working. We need a new approach. We need all of the voices at the new table as we figure out what to do about climate change. And how do we do that? Is by amplifying those who have been most oppressed, as we've heard today. I want to acknowledge that I'm telling today a story about the University of Colorado, and that there are STEM colleagues from colleges and universities from all around the nation on this call. I think that I was asked to be on this panel because my story is your story, and perhaps you knowing my story will inspire you to find ways to prompt large-scale action as well. So on June 8th, No Time for Silence was released. If you haven't reread the call recently, I highly recommend it, especially those that have been doing book readings and listening sessions. I think rereading the call now, you will have a new perspective as you have hopefully gained some additional insight and knowledge. One line from the No Time for Silence website is, we all need to take decisive actions that call on leaders in the academy, industry, state and federal government, professional societies, and the nonprofit sector to develop substantive and multi-pronged strategies to remove systemic racism in our community. On June 8th, 2020, I was in a town hall held by my program, Environmental Studies, where almost 100 of us had a 10-minute window on our agenda to talk about our feelings about George Floyd. Some graduate students and I decided that we would use that 10 minutes to call for a separate town hall meeting where we could talk about George Floyd and also talk about what we can do in our program to make changes, to make a commitment that we were going to change what we're doing, to center ourselves around anti-racism. So that gets us to June 10th, Shutdown STEM Day. A line from the Shutdown STEM website. Those of us who are not Black, particularly those of us who are white, play a key role in perpetuating systemic racism. Direct actions are needed to stop this injustice. Unless you engage directly with eliminating racism, you are perpetuating it. This moment calls for profound and meaningful change. So on June 10th, some graduate students in my program, Environmental Studies, hosted a town hall. We had 53 in attendance. We first read a website statement that we wanted to replace the website statement that had been put up on our website. And we also read a 1.5-page list of action items, immediate action items that we had put together that we felt could be done in our program rapidly to ensure that we were committed to centering ourselves around anti-racism. By June 18th, I decided I was going to get loud with my request that CU Boulder acknowledge their insensitivity and commit to creating large-scale change. So I typed up an email. And in that email, I first introduced myself. I'm a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow. I'm a CU Boulder Graduate School Diversity Fellowship recipient. And I'm a SOARS protege from 2018 and 2019, which is a research internship hosted by the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, or UCAR. Between these three fellowships or internships that I had earned, I was told repeatedly that I'm a leader in science and a leader in STEM, and I believe that I am. So in this email that I sent to every faculty member I had ever met at CU Boulder, I first introduced myself, and then I said that I think that my life experience and my skills can help in this situation. I think in terms of big things, big concepts. My research is on a global scale. I think on a global scale. I think that I can help in this situation, and I'm offering myself to do that. I also conveyed in this email that I was giving myself a 2-week deadline before I would decide if I would stay or if I would leave. And at the time, I had been a graduate student for about 9 months. I really didn't feel proud that I had chosen CU Boulder for my graduate studies, and I didn't feel that I could continue at a university that is knowingly doing nothing to address eradicating racism in their institution. And I felt like I should share that because I wanted to show the level of my conviction. And I understood that I was just one student, but I also wanted them to know, and anyone that saw that email, that I really meant it to my core, and I still do to this day. So it happened. Faculty members did forward my email, and I'm grateful to those that did. Thank you to those that did. And I started having Zoom meetings. So in those 2 weeks, I had over 24 Zooms. I started meeting Black students at CU Boulder and forming friendships and alliances. And I also wrote a petition with colleagues and released it. On June 23rd, change my slide. On June 23rd, I and 9 graduate students and a postdoc released a petition. And on the same day, we opened 3 social media accounts to help us spread the word about the petition. Now, since the petition has been released, we've got almost 3,000 signatures, and our group has grown from 10 to 75, and it spans undergraduate to faculty. And we call ourselves Diversify CU Now. What we want is in our name, and everything that we do is in action. The mission of Diversify CU Now is twofold. The first is to find and amplify our Black, Indigenous, people of color, students, staff, and faculty, and to amplify their voices and their actions. And the second is to put pressure on campus leadership and CU leadership to do the same. The makeup of Diversify CU Now is primarily white students, as that is the demographic of CU. But I see this as a good thing. I think that white folks need to be telling white leaders that they want change too, and then they're not going to tolerate blanket statements that do not translate to positive impacts of Black people on our campuses. Diversify CU Now is focused on amplifying people from all campuses. We have grown from just the Boulder campus. We're focusing on all 4 of the University of Colorado campuses. And we're also expanding to additional colleges and universities across Colorado. If you'd like to talk more about this, I will certainly make myself available. Some of the things that Diversify CU Now has done since July is hosted watch parties, social media storms, we've hosted letter writing campaigns, we've offered public comment, and we've provided people power to Black, Indigenous, and people of color's actions. What we have found in doing these things is that we're not only a more engaged community with one another, we are primarily students, graduate students and undergraduate students. We're engaging with one another in a meaningful way that we weren't prior to doing this work, but we're also finding and engaging with our BIPOC colleagues and forming friendships and alliances. And this feels much more gratifying than sitting at home and wondering, what should we do? So we are doing, and we're very happy about that. We're feeling good about that. And I should add, I did decide to stay because of the alliances that I've made and the friendships that I've formed since I sent that initial letter. From my own activity amongst Diversify CU Now and as a graduate student in the CU system, my efforts are twofold. One is to go up the chain of the hierarchy of CU And second is to go broad amongst the student body. Dr. Morris referred to this earlier today, but I definitely believe that in organizing the student voice and aligning our message, this is certainly how we can create change at our university. And combine that with forming alliances with those that are at the top, which in our case in the Colorado system are the regents. My idea is that you take those at the bottom, which are the students, and in this case, our BIPOC students, and they're engaging with those at the top, who are the regents. Then we have the potential to create a ripple effect across our campus and across all of our campuses, and that model can grow to other universities. So I've included here on my slide, since July, I've had Zoom meetings with higher ups. I'm at the several dozen now. I'm organizing at the program level. That's my program, Environmental Studies. And also I'm a member of the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research, or INSTAR. I'm also working to help organize Diversify CU Now. And at the Boulder campus, I've allied with the most active BIPOC students, staff, and faculty to align in our messages and demands to leadership. I changed my life. I changed my priorities. I work with urgency, and I acknowledge that my actions affect Black and BIPOC people who are oppressed and silenced even today. So since June 18, when my first email went out, I want to make sure I'm on the right slide here. Yes. To faculty, I've met with over 24 higher ups in the hierarchy in Zoom meetings. I've also co-authored a statement with Regent Shoemaker directed to CU Boulder chancellors and provost, the president, and the CU communications director. As a side note, we have not received a response to that statement, but I have had some success stories, so I want to share those with you. And that is that in some of these, from some of these Zoom meetings that I have, some have been activated, most of all being Regent Linda Shoemaker. Linda has shown time and again since July that she is committed to amplifying the voices of our BIPOC colleagues, including publicly giving her support to the CU Anti-Racist Creed and its sister document, the CU Anti-Racist Classroom Addressal, that were written by the Radical BIPOC Women Ex Femmes Collective. Another higher up who is potentially up and coming is the COO and Interim Executive Vice Chancellor, Patrick O'Rourke. Patrick seems to have reached that critical point of recognizing his own lack of action and that there is so much opportunity that he has to create change in the position that he's currently in. So I'm hopeful that we're going to see actions and direction from Patrick as someone who is in a position to do so soon. But to Linda and Pat, I also want to say that this is no way a pat on the back. As my mentor and STEM colleague, Anthony Wilson, fellow Soares protege and student at Central Michigan University, always says to me, keep it up. So there have been and are some challenges too, such as those in positions of power in the CU hierarchy that have not made the connection that their lack of action in the past is the reason why Black people continue to be oppressed at CU, even today. Until those positions of power confess their part in perpetuating racism, even if just to themselves, they will not act to create change. They will instead work within the space of damage control and waste their time and energy on positioning themselves. And I know you all know what I'm talking about because this is what we've been living through for the last decades. They'll say words that go together well in sentences, but their hearts and their minds are not behind those words. And that's really the key to doing this work. So I want to use this opportunity to call out those who need to make anti-racism their first priority every single day where they work. And at the top, these are the CU regents: Sue Sharkey, Chance Hill, Heidi Ganal, John Carson, Glenn Gallegos, Jack Kroll, Irene Griego, Leslie Smith, and Linda Shoemaker. And this also applies to the incoming regents after November's election. And side note, please vote. The CU community wants to see you and hear you talking about anti-racism in every aspect of every decision that you make. We don't want it to be, a line item at various board meetings. We want you talking about it on every line item in every committee meeting. And at the Boulder campus, I call out the Chancellor, Phil DeStefano, Executive Vice Chancellor Patrick O'Rourke, Provost Russ Moore, Vice Provost Michelle Moses, Vice Chancellor Bob Boswell, and Odyssey, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Community Engagement. I've been told that Diversify CU Now is doing the work that Odyssey should be doing. So how about we team up? And I know I'm almost out of time. I'm watching the clock. President Mark Kennedy, you have a lot of work to do. Not only do you say the right words in regent meetings that somehow convinces them that you care about DEI work at CU, you say all of the wrong words too. Your consistently inappropriate racist and homophobic comments, including the recent Purple Ink protocol and your statement of there being a trail of tears if CU's budget situation does not improve, reinforces racist and homophobic systems and supports an exclusive community at CU. This type of behavior will not be tolerated. We are going to hold you accountable for your behavior, and we also call on those that Kennedy reports to do the same. And to all of you that are on the call today, here's my call to action for you. Start here and do this every day. Support and amplify the voices and actions of BIPOC students, staff, faculty, and administration. Engage and pay BIPOC colleagues for their work. If you ever find yourself wondering why no one in your Zoom meeting is talking about racism or anti-racism in your department, your program, your unit, or on your team, this means it is your calling to be the one to say something. It is super scary, and your voice might shake. Mine did, but consider the consequences when you don't. We're creating a new culture in academia and STEM, where it is normal to talk about anti-racism and how important and urgent it is to find and amplify the voices of those most oppressed. Before I finish today, I want to acknowledge the dozens of questions that were submitted when you registered for this event. And while there's no way that we can address each one during this event, I did sit down and answer each question that was submitted, and I'm happy to email it out. It sounds like it'll also be placed on the website for this event. And so we will be sure and get to you because we really want to keep this conversation going. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Holly. Without further ado, let's give the microphone to Valerie and continue this conversation. I'm seeing a lot of questions popping up. I'm really excited about that. So let's go for it, Valerie.
You're muted. You're muted, Valerie. You are muted.
Okay. Sorry. All right. Sorry about that. Am I sharing?
Yes,
Yes.
you're good.
All right. I'm Valerie Otero. I'm a professor of science education at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm most well known for two programs that I co-founded. And the first is called Physics Through Evidence, Empowerment Through Reasoning. And it operates at the high school level with teachers and students, really cultivating a culture of expert learning rather than expert knowing. And then the other program is the International Learning Assistant Alliance, or the Learning Assistant Program, which is an international program, and that operates at the college university level and utilizes undergraduates to broker negotiation and meeting across the various boundaries that exist at the university. And I'm now putting up my, I can't seem to advance. Oh, okay. This is the main theme that goes through most of my work in short. And then this is on the bottom, you now see CU Boulder's logo, because I am talking about institutional racism today. And I'm talking about it in the context of CU Boulder, but I want it to be very clear that the University of Colorado Boulder, my administrators, my colleagues, and the students have been extremely supportive in my growth and development throughout this time. By way of continued introduction, I am a carny. I come from a carnival, the New Mexico State Fair, and I've worked there pretty much all of my life, along with a mom and pop grocery store that I grew up with in my family, and I've been working there about 30 hours per week since I had been working there since I was in middle school. And I'm a first generation college student. My parents wanted to go to college, but were dissuaded from doing so and did not have that opportunity. And finally, I'm Chicana, and that's extremely important in the kind of stories that I will be telling. As I embark on my stories, I first want to say that anti-racism, it's a lifelong activity. And imagine, we got to resist the urge or the inclination to call on the person of color to just tell us what to do. Just tell us what to do. We really care. We'll do it. And in some systemic cases, or at least we'll hire someone to do it. And they do. Systems hire entry-level positions to take care of this racism problem. And while those positions are very important, they're not solving the problem. It's a lifetime learning activity. Imagine somebody says, hey, Valerie, I want to do this geophysics stuff. You do geophysics. I want to do it. Just tell me what to do. And I'll say, well, you got to learn a lot of continuum mechanics. And that includes a whole lot of physics and mathematics. You can start apprenticing, but you've got a lot of learning to do. So if we're going to embark on anti-racist activity, reading and learning, there's one link there that can get people started in finding the kinds of resources that we need to study in order to truly embark on this activity, and listening to the stories of the people who have been so deeply impacted by systemic racism, and finally speaking out. And that's what I'm doing here. And we talked about trust in the last section. I trust you. And I'm going to tell stories. Look, my first story is called Silently Ousted. And this story happened in my very early career when I was a brand new assistant professor. And right before I started my job, a colleague, he had been there for 30 years, was an astrophysicist. And this is the first anti-racist activity I'll talk about, called me up and said, want to collaborate? He didn't say, I want to help you. I want to take care of you. He said, I need to learn from you. I don't know any of this physics education research stuff. I'm just an astrophysicist. We need to work together because I want to build this program, which ended up becoming the Learning Assistant Program. And the silently ousted word is a word I made up at this event. We had established some ideas and we were sharing them with his colleagues. And these colleagues were also National Academy members. They were decorated, well-known scientists. And we were all sitting there and we were talking about this big idea. And finally, I get the courage to speak up and look at my video, if you will. Here's what I end up doing. I go, it's going to be great. Okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to teach them epistemology. We're going to teach them metacognition. They're going to be empowered. It's going to be a great pedagogy class. All of a sudden I looked and they looked frightened. They looked confused. And one of them looked at the other and went like this. Anyway, and continued where the conversation left off before I bolted in. Now, I need to tell you, not one of these great men is racist by any means. They have supported me my entire career and continue to do so. Systemic racism is rarely something that someone has. It's a narrative. It's a way of understanding membership in a community that sustains the traditional arrangements that lead to certain types of people achieving positions of influence and silently, accidentally ousting those that are just outside the error bar of acceptable behavior, which is exactly where I was. So I bought a suit jacket. Look at me. I wore this thing for 3 years straight for two big reasons. One, to remind myself, not to bob my head, not to do the heavy metal symbol, and to maybe, modulate a little more, and also to look professional. For better or for worse, it worked. It worked. Well, it almost worked, because now my next story, it's called Who Gets Opportunities? And this one took place much later in my career. I've already got tenure. I'm a full professor. And I'm in this position where the next major opportunity, and it was a good opportunity, would be to be promoted to this next position. And it would have opened up a lot of things for me. And at the same time, more than anybody else in my unit, I was around campus. I was working with 4 colleges and schools. I was engaged with 15 different departments. I knew what was going on in hundreds of classrooms around campus. And that's what this promotion was. Well, I didn't get it. There were 4 white women involved in this movida. And what they did was this one person was brought into my position temporarily and then promoted to the next position. Okay, I finally got the courage 5 years later to say, what happened? By the way, I didn't even know that she was taking over my job until after it had happened. I was the only one that didn't know. So finally, 5 years later, I finally asked, what on earth happened? How did this possibly happen? And I was told, this is my picture of, here's why it happens. This is my interpretation of why it happened, is because we like to promote people who look like us on paper or in our behaviors. And I didn't. This is what I look like. This is the way I act. I'm Rasa, and that's what's happening. And so I was less likely to look like one of those leaders. 5 years later, when I asked, I was told, you're not a leader. You're antagonistic. And then I thought about it, like, how am I antagonistic? I do push back on ideas. I do, I'm skeptical. And I asked, I said, well, there's this other white guy in our community that does basically the same thing I do. And sometimes we joke about how we have each other's back. I said, is he antagonistic? I was told, no, he does it in a white man's way. And he has evidence. And so I'm thinking the same behavior, one of them's antagonistic, the other one is lauded for their behavior. This is not just my story. This is your story. There are so many people that are sitting right out there in their chairs right now, knowing that this happened to them. Look, it was written about in this ethnography. And this one is about a Black girl in a high school science classroom. The science classroom used all these new evidence-based methods. And she was interested, and she was asking questions, and she was raising her hand, and she was pushing back on things. And at first she was the best student, and a good student. But then she started looking like, oh my God, this girl is the best science student in the class and probably the school, and nobody knew what to do with that. And you know what she became? Antagonistic. And the narrative went from the teacher to the students and propagated throughout the system. See, all is well as long as you're striving to be successful if you're a person of color. But the system must resist the urge to nurture and accept potential success as long as these people of color are striving. Even when my dad was moving up in the grocery business world from bag boy to manager, he heard them say those Mexicans can only go so far. But this is me now. I went that far thanks to the suit jacket, and now I am a leader, and I've been awarded. This is the next anti-racist activity, and this is the American Physical Society giving me and my program, the Learning Assistant Alliance, the award for excellence in physics education. Despite this kind of stuff, they accepted the difference that I offered, because you think about it, is the Learning Assistant Alliance, is it a professional society? Maybe. I mean, it actually has a leadership council. I've never been on it. It's other faculty members and young scholars from around the country. Or is it a grocery business or a state fair business? We do bring in income as a means by which to sustain ourselves. Well, yeah, it's exactly both of those things. Because when you bring in people from diverse communities, you get different models that do look a little bit different, but you've got to resist the urge to say you're not a leader because you don't look the same. This antagonistic narrative it propagates throughout the system and it will follow you, and it diminishes opportunities for these scholars, even the older ones like myself, but also for the younger ones that would have just seen you in these fabulous positions of leadership. So resist the urge to view those that are like you as more competent than those not like you. And this is systemic racism. So some of the reasons why this kind of thing happens, I'm now going to get into some real personal story, because I think it'll help to elaborate a principle that I'm going to pull out of all of this. I hope. Oh, look, here's the state fair. This is our booth. This is my booth at the New Mexico State Fair, my family's booth. It's the sole or the main source of income for my family, and it's called Casa de Fruta. Anyway, so how do you go from working in a state fair to becoming a leader of these programs and even a professor at CU Boulder? And not only that, I build leaders. Like some of them you meet in high school or university undergraduates, and some of them are postdocs, but they have become, I've mentored them to become leaders in their own right. They are national leaders in STEM education. Well, the first thing you have to do is you got to go to college. And that's not so easy, you know. After high school, I was taking care of my grandma Mercedes, and I found out that at least for a little while, my Uncle Francisco had gone to college. And I thought, And also, I was trying to get rid of this, or at least hide from an abusive boyfriend I thought maybe if I hide out at the university for 6 hours a day, University of New Mexico, that'll be helpful. And I had plenty of money because I had been working at my dad's grocery store 30 hours a week since I was about 12 years old. So I go there and I fall in love with mathematics, and then astrophysics and geophysics and physics. And I was good at it. And I was, as long as, and I was doing it all the time, except of course, when I was taking care of my sister Vicky, because my parents were working at the grocery store. And so I had to take her to elementary school, pick her up, and often go to parent-teacher conferences. Another thing that happened, I'm going to make a point, another thing that happened when I was studying for my junior level mechanics class, the night before my junior level mechanics class, I was raped at gunpoint in my house. And I had to tell my professor the next day, I think I know why I blew the test. And so he started to know a little bit about this, and he was also somebody who had been recognizing my talent. Other things he didn't know about was before my quantum mechanics test, I sat in that, not in the jail cell, but in the place outside the jail in those horribly uncomfortable plastic chairs with steel bottoms from 10 p.m. until 4 a.m. studying my quantum mechanics because I had to wait for a loved one to get out of jail. Oh, and these are just smatterings of the kinds of things that occur. This one was the grocery store, the meat cutter at my dad's grocery store, who had been molesting me since I was 12 years old. So my advisor knew a little bit about this and sent me to the REU program. That's where they found me. They taught me about graduate school, and I ended up coming to CU Boulder straight from there. Here's my point. With any group of people that come from communities that are traditionally underrepresented, you're going to find disadvantage. And look at all this advantage as well. There's quite a bit of advantage, but with disadvantage comes trauma. And with trauma comes differences in our identities and in the ways we come to understand the world, to see the world, and to act and behave in the world. And with all of this comes diversity. Here's my schematic. It's real easy to get silently ousted. Why? Because the systemic orb doesn't have the right shape for you, see? And then when they say, oh, we got to increase diversity, we need a few more of those triangles, and maybe, well, we definitely need more of those stars. And so let's get a few of those, and then we'll be a diverse campus. That's not the way it's going to work, because that shape don't fit into those spaces that are available. What we're really looking for is is not looking for different colors of the same thing. Instead, understanding that when we are working with communities from diverse backgrounds, it is a different thing. And that's what we're supposed to be celebrating rather than trying to transition it. And it's the orb that needs to be redefined so that it has a greater and better understanding of these people. And that's why we're telling these stories, because I think it's important for people to understand the communities from which we come. So for all of you people of color out there, you earned that crown and they didn't give you that crown. And so I give you that crown now. And for those of you who come from more privileged backgrounds, I really, truly wish you the best in your lifelong journey of anti-racist activity. So thank you so much for listening to my stories.
Thank you so much, Valerie. I really want to thank the three of you. You brought different perspectives and we have a lot of questions. Let me start. I will read two and I will ask you to come up with some, your take at them. The first one is for everyone. Are you prioritizing, how are you, are we prioritizing well for justice and equity within the STEM fields at institutions across Colorado? How could we do better? And this is by Heidi Stelzer. The question two is, could be for everyone too, right? What can junior scientists do to help improve workplace cultures and environments? So if you could just be brief, just to allow for the dialogue to take place and for me to get more questions to you, that would be great. Thank you. Who wants to, I mean, it's for everyone. Who wants to take it first? Perhaps Karen?
Okay, sure. I think, so I think there were two questions in there, one related to sort of structural change in STEM fields at Colorado institutions, and the other maybe more related to individual action. Is that right? Okay. So I think it's a tough question, right? Because there's a lot that needs to happen and there's a lot that needs to be done at all of those scales. I talk a lot about the individuals, that actions that we can take in terms of investigating and sort of actively acknowledging our roles and our positionality in our work, right? And also the histories of the work that we do. How has STEM oppressed communities in the past? How does STEM and science and people who use science in certain ways continue to oppress certain groups? And so I think being upfront and explicit about some of those histories when we're teaching science and the way that we present science is one sort of strategy to overcome that. I have other thoughts, but I actually think Val and Holly have said them better. So one is just Holly's really key kind of bottom down and top up structures and efforts, and right, so centering student voices, right? These systems are theoretically for students to learn and for students to grow. And so centering student voices in that process at the same time, making structures and relationships and collaborations with the higher ups to ultimately build across those different sort of bottom up and top down structures. And the other, and I love the way that Val put it, this idea of kind of reshaping the ball and right, thinking about diversity, right? Or JEDI, as I like to think about it more broadly, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion as a different shape, right? It needs to take a different form in the way that we teach, in the way that we structure institutions, in the way that we do science effectively.
Let me, okay, so if Holly or Valerie want to jump in with any quick comment, that would be great.
I think everybody recognizes that stuff needs to be done. Now it's a matter of people educating themselves to have a deeper understanding of what the issues are, which is why I think it's so important to hear these kinds of stories so people can understand what the issues are. One of them that I think that we're doing at CU Boulder is programs like the Learning Assistant Program, but we've got others which are really bringing in students as a part of the teaching instructional team. And they're helping to broker meaning, and they're helping to help students and faculty negotiate understanding across diverse communities. And that really is serving as a way for people to find their place.
Thank you. Holly, do you want to jump in?
Yes, yes, thank you. I wanted to address Charlotte because I think you said junior scientists, so maybe I fit into that category. And so my answer to that on what junior scientists can do to help improve the culture and the environment is to work on the things that you can control. And there are things that all of us can control, even at the student level. So my questions to you are, who do you collaborate with? Who do you cite in your papers? Reach out to BIPOC colleagues, not just at your institution or in your department, but in your field. Find ways to find and amplify the voices of those that are doing work similar to yours or that do work in your surroundings. And find ways to invite or make up ways to invite so that you can engage with your BIPOC colleagues. I think that's really what it comes down to again and again and again, is to actually engage. Thanks.
Oh, this is great. There's another question, and this has really to do with intersecting mechanisms of exclusion, and many of us can speak to them. But a key question for all of us in this conversation is, how can we academic and research institutions and the people who are on top of those make sure that we can improve accountability among leadership, including faculty, right, for attitudes and practices that push out women, people of color. And I really want to unpack people of color, because I'm a Latinx, you know, and I also belong to this, you know, and so how can we work to hold all of us accountable for these very subtle mechanisms that are up in the air and that really contribute to exclude us? I mean, even for our accent and, you know, our way of speaking. So what can we do? Because I see that two of you are really talking about your experiences and how you act upon them. Of course, Karen also brought up this bigger perspective, but what can you tell based on your different entry points, your different experiences with these mechanisms of exclusion? And this time, let's start with Valerie and go around.
Okay, so how to keep people accountable for whether it's a microaggression or macroaggression that is caused. And one of the ways is to call them out. And the thing that sucks is that you can't always be the guy calling people out. I can't always be that person. It's got to be the people that are hanging around that see it, that have to say, hey, that wasn't cool, you know. And so, or even maybe you're going to be wrong about it, but you have to do it. And then they're not going to hear it or understand it at first. Like the story I've told, one of those stories I told, I mean, I brought it up 3 times and they still haven't heard it. Like they haven't heard it yet. And so I'm going to bring it up again. You know, you have to be accountable for this thing. You have to at least acknowledge that it occurred. And again, I think that's one of the biggest things, is that you have to bring it up. You have to continue to bring it up. And then the people that are also around you have to be it. Because if you keep bringing it up, you look like you're just sitting around complaining all the time. And now you get even into a worse condition than you were before.
Thank you. So why don't we ask now Karen what she thinks about, I mean, what is your take at this very important question?
Yeah, I think sort of related to calling it out is normalizing conversations, right? And I think others have brought this up in the panel, in the previous panel, and Holly brought this up as well, right? It shouldn't just be an afterthought, talking about anti-racism or talking about a lack of diversity in your field, right? We should be thinking about this in everything that we do and talking about it in everything that we do. So Holly mentioned, who are you citing? Who's in your syllabus? When you start to do work in a new place, how are you interacting with the communities? Are you effectively engaging them? And making space to have these conversations in your departments, in your committee meetings, et cetera, create a culture of inclusion and create a space for people to have these conversations, and make it so you don't feel like you're the only one who is calling folks out, and make it so that everybody can recognize when it's appropriate, right? What's actually happened, what's being done wrong here, and we need to call that out and actively address it. So I think the normalization process, which is happening now, I think more as this conversation sort of comes to the fore, is really key as well. Yeah, to come to mind.
Great, Karen. And before giving the word to Holly, in my experience, not everything can be open and confrontational, so to speak. You know, there are also subtle mechanisms, face-to-face conversations to address these issues, because some people feel more comfortable when they do, you know, engage in more intimate conversations. Holly, you have been very engaged in this. What can you tell us about dealing with the open conversations vis-a-vis the face-to-face, you know, conversations, which for me are equally important? What can you say about that?
Well, yeah, I'm very focused on having small group conversations and one-on-one conversations. Even to this day, I'm emailing higher ups. I always do the quotation marks because I'm not a fan of the current hierarchy and power structure. I'm emailing higher ups to request one-on-one Zoom meetings. Specifically, at just Monday, I sent an email to Chancellor DeStefano and asked him for a one-on-one Zoom, because I think that allows for the opportunity. I mean, it's one perk we can take from COVID-19 is that Zoom meetings make us a lot more accessible. And we can also continue to have conversations like this. I don't know if there's something to be said from the comfort of your home, that you're talking about something that's very deeply rooted inside of you and you're talking about your heart. But I think from what I've seen that it is coming together to provide an environment or a space that we can be having these conversations that might have been a lot harder underneath fluorescent lights sitting around a conference table in a cold room. So I'm going to take advantage of that. I think others should take advantage of that. And then the other thing I just wanted to add to what Val and Karen were saying is that it is all about holding them accountable. And so I'm a student. I think that as a student body, when the students are organized and those at the top know that the students are watching and paying attention, which requires that we educate ourselves as to what the current structure is, that's part of it. And so that falls on us. And I think that it's very doable. And I think that it's something that we can do. And I'm hopeful that students at other universities will feel the same way and approach it the same way. It also helps us, if we understand the structure, then we can be providing our input on how to change it, especially considering so many of us are going to be the future of academia and university life.
Oh, this is great. I will just pose one question to the three of you. And it relates to something Karen showed when she gave her presentation. And this is the fact that if you are a woman, if you are a Latinx, if you know, in somehow are out there like an outlier, in somehow there is a kind of psychosocial pressure for you to do more. You are also asked to be in panels, to help Latinx, to speak to kids. And this really poses a lot of work and additional burden on you. What do you suggest? What is your experience? Can you tell us as to how to address this? How to also engage with many who are organizing this event, who really want to be part of this coalition that is calling for a more inclusive environment at CU, in Colorado, and in many places. What can you tell about this additional burden that we face, right? We have upon us to show that we can be also, you know, or that we don't want to, I mean, we can be also good scientists or good social scientists. I'm a social scientist. That's another burden I need to say, but I don't want to talk about that. What can you tell about this? This time, let's start with Holly, and then we go with Karen and Valerie. And I think with this, we will need to close because it's almost time to close this conversation.
Okay, thank you for giving me the floor first, although I think I'm least qualified to answer this question. But I will say from my experience at CU Boulder is number one, we take turns. And I know I've gotten into a routine with the Diversify CU Now organizers and with the BIPOC allies that we work together, that before a meeting, we hop on early and we ask who's feeling it today. Because a lot of times you're just not feeling it, but maybe one person is. And then second thing I'll say is I'm new here. I'm new to academia. I'm new to this work in academia. and I have a lot of energy. And so I am going for it. And hopefully I can help carry some of that burden to some extent. And the last thing I'll say is that those that I work with closest to Ian Diversify CU now are becoming fluent and confident in themselves enough that they're now doing this work at this level where they are having conversations with groups and leading the conversation, et cetera, and feeling confident that they are carrying the message that our BIPOC colleagues would want them to be carrying to the non-BIPOC folks.
Thank you so much. Now it's Karen, please go ahead.
I think a key thing to remember, well, this is a constant struggle. I'm also relatively new to the CU setting, but I've had lots of conversations in particular with the faculty of color group. And that's a space where a lot of this comes up. So it's a consistent struggle, and it's one that there's not an easy answer to. I think it's important to acknowledge that. A key thing that I think about is leveraging our own individual strengths to kind of minimize that burnout. We can't all do everything. We shouldn't all do everything, but we all have specific skills that can kind of take the movement forward, right? So I think of myself as a convener, and I want to bring people together and create spaces for people to connect. But right, there are certain things that Holly or Valerie might be more suited to do in the broader context of the movement. And I think really going through the process of kind of identifying your skills and identifying your purpose. And I think that's also a really valuable sort of self-reflection that we all can do also is really important. I also think that leaders and leadership need to recognize that the potential for this burden and the potential for it to detract from success. And I think that increasingly department chairs, deans, et cetera, are acknowledging that and recognizing that and attempting to minimize kind of the trickle down impacts of that burden. But I think it's an important conversation about what success looks like, how do we define success, and how might our time allocations be different for people who feel like they have to be a martyr for the cause, right? Because they're the only one. How can we consider that? How can we create structures to prevent that from happening so they can still do science, right? So they can still learn and grow. And I think that there are a lot of higher ups who are starting to rethink what that looks like.
Thank you so much, Karen. Valerie.
It's a real tension. It's a major tension because the students, for example, that come to your office that are lined up outside your office wanting some support, you know, they're going to come to your office. You can't send them away. You can't say to them, hey, go down the hall to this other guy that's writing a book right now, instead of me writing a book, you know? And so that's just a tension. And I completely agree with Karen and Holly when we talk about in what ways, well, let me just say, I do feel that our provost and chancellor are risk takers and that they do want to take a risk. And sometimes they put together committees hoping that the committee will come back with a risky idea. But when you get all of us together, we end up with, you know, a very bland idea. And so I think that maybe not doing everything by committee and maybe generating a few, okay, here's my new policy and it's going into effect and you're all going to be pissed off at me as usual. That might be the way to go, because once you put them in a committee, they end up with the spherical cow, and you're stuck with that as a policy. So and then there's the tension between policies and change. You know, the policies is not always the answer either, but there's got to be a way for a person whose publication record is hurting because of the additional work they do. Or there's got to be a creative way of documenting the public work in a way that is as revered as the standard journal publication, for example.
No, these are great, great ideas, insights. I really want to thank everyone for being so amazing. I also want to thank Max and Matt and Kadidia and everyone for organizing this event. I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation. I agree with someone who told in the first panel that this is a huge opportunity. This is a watershed. We better take advantage of it. We better do something to be the change we want to see in the world, or else no one will do it for us. So thank you everyone. I don't know, Max, if you want to, or Khadija, if you want to say something just to finalize this. But yeah, I'm excited. This is really amazing.
Thank you, Patty. This is Matt. Before I pass it back to Max and Khadija, I just wanted to say a few brief words about the next steps. So first of all, thank you to all the attendees, and in particularly, thanks for submitting your questions during the registration. Thanks to those of you that submitted questions to the Q&A function within Zoom. We apologize that we weren't able to get to all questions. But going back to a point that Dr. Morris made at the very start, the questions that we ask are important, not only for the questions that they may lead to, but how they are indicative of our way of thinking. And so we are going to be compiling questions and sharing those out with all of you, all that attended in our follow-up communications. We will also be sharing a video of this Zoom webinar and posting it on our website so that you can revisit the perspectives that were shared and hopefully share it with others. And also going back to Dr. Smythe's point, that this is not one conversation, that this is lifelong learning. We want to stay engaged with all of you and to find opportunities for you to continue to share your perspectives and perhaps more importantly, your commitments in your stories. We haven't fully identified how we will do that yet, but that is a priority of ours moving forward. And so please stay in touch, and we will stay in touch with all that attended to identify those opportunities so that we can all continue to learn together and contribute to some collective action on this topic. So thank you to all. I will be passing this now to Khadija and Max.
Thanks so much, Matt. And thank you to our second panel. That was another wonderful panel. Thank you, Karen, Holly, Valerie, and thank you, Patty, for your facilitation. I just want to extend some additional thanks. There's been a whole team of people that are behind the scenes, not on camera today. From here at CU Boulder, Presley Church. I want to thank Presley, also Amy Naku-Schmidt, Katie Human, Kelsey Simpkins, and Katie Weeman. From AAAS, I want to thank Dan Barry, who runs the local science engagement networks across the various states, and also thank Tiffany Lowwater from AAAS, who's helped us with promotions. Thank the Western Colorado University team from the Masters in Environmental Management program, led by Jenny DeMarco. So that is Dimitra Biddle, Molly Maisel, Erin Mercado, Shannon Hessler, and Chris Mederi. And then I finally want to thank the ongoing Colorado Local Science Engagement Network Advisory Group. We have a great group that is composed of Colorado Senator Kerry Donovan, as well as Bené Duncan from Ceres Western Water Assessment, Lisbeth Finseth from CU Denver, Chelsea Nagy from CU Ceres Earth Lab, Dan Powers from CoLabs, and Patty Romero-Lancao, who is our facilitator, who represents the University of Chicago as well as the National Renewable Energy Lab, Kirsten Schuckman from the CU Office of Government Affairs, Colorado State Senator Ray Scott, Heidi Stelzer from Fort Lewis College, who actually asked one of the questions today, Suzanne Teagan from the Center for a New Energy Economy at Colorado State, and Khadija, who's been a big part of this event, who runs significant opportunities in atmospheric research and science at UCAR. And then last, Christine Wiedenmeyer, who is also at CERES, the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Khadija, to wrap things up. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Max, and thanks to all of our esteemed panelists. We really did receive an education and food for thought on ways that we can continue this conversation and be the action and spur the action that we need to dismantle this centuries-long oppression. I would just like to remind all of the attendees that you will receive a Zoom link for a survey as soon as you exit the Zoom platform. Please complete the survey. We really do appreciate all of your feedback and thoughts on this issue. As Max and Matt said, we will definitely post the recording on our website, as well as have a section where we can have some answers and also have ideas so that we can move forward. You know, that can be many things. It could be a position paper, it could be recommendations for policy, etc. So I just want to thank all of the organizers, all of the hosts, all of the panelists, and all of the marketers and promotions that we receive from Western Colorado University team, and enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks again. Bye.